So it seemed like a good time to do a Puppet Master ranking. This is one that I've been promising for a while now, but it was always a little daunting because it's more movies than normal. But I figured if I didn't do this ranking now, then they would go ahead and release like 3 more before I got another chance. So let's see how this all goes. Now, this is one in which the films have a bit of a reputation for being, well, bad. So I thought that this was a great candidate for us to go in reverse order and start with the best and then count down the rest. And these are the films of the series. It's the main run of the franchise, but also the 2 spin-off films and the unofficial crossover with Demonic Toys and the remake, but not including Puppet Master Legacy, which isn't really a movie and is more of a clip show, so I didn't include it. And like always, I sent this list out to my patrons on patreon.com/movietimelines, and these guys answered the call. 36 people participated this month and put their favorite film at number 1, and their second at number 2, and so on down the list, with their 14th favorite film in dead last. That means that the best score that a film could have would be 36 points, and the worst it could do would be 504. So, let's do it. Let's dive in and play with some toys here and find out which is the worst with no strings attached. Since we're going in reverse order, we have our number 1 film here, the top of the heap, and we had a pretty clear winner here with 96 points. A pretty low score, and it's the prequel of sorts, Puppet Master 3, Toulon's Revenge. This was never put into dead last, but it did get one 11th place spot and was put into first place 12 times, a third of the rankings. And yeah, this was my number 1 as well, and this is really where I think that they sort of unlocked what these movies should be, even if they were never quite able to reproduce it. But before this, they had approached it as a tiny terror kind of film, and of course the puppets were villains, but there was this notion that they were under control. So this was the first time they showed them doing terrible things for the forces of good, and it really worked. At the time, having it set in World War II was a little more novel as well for a horror franchise. And keep in mind, this was in a time where I guess it wasn't controversial to say that Nazis were bad guys and people didn't defend them in the comments, which they probably will here, because I guess acknowledging that they were villains is what people who don't know what the word virtue signaling means call it. And what's crazy to me is that this is only slightly more money than the first film, and yet this looks like it has so much more production value. The sets, the costumes, the vehicles, all of it make it look like a genuine film and really sell that World War II vibe. You're also getting the introduction of Six Shooter, easily one of the more popular puppet designs, and I really think that the last one that they added that really stuck, and probably one of the few of them that seems to have an active personality with that snidely Whiplash laugh of his. But like I said, this has all the things that I believe make a Puppet Master movie work. First up, you have the puppets doing what they do best, and they get a fair amount of screen time. As these go on, and the money to use them got less and less, the plots had less to do with the actual guys themselves and focused more on the humans to save funds. But this still uses the little dudes the right amount. Then, it's got series lore with the origin story and giving some background on Toulon and his various mysteries. And then finally, you've got some strong villains with the Nazi crew. And whereas some of the later ones would go back to that well, it's missing in other departments, as we'll soon see. But this one balances it all and does it wonderfully, and totally deserves its number 1 spot.
Tomorrow we start all over again. Killing murderers in the middle of a war.
In second place, and this was interesting because it was never really a close race, but it wasn't a blowout either. This was in second pretty much the entire time, and it started to gain on first a bit near the end, but not quite enough, because with 108 points, about 12 points lower, is the OG Puppet Master from 1989. This one was also never in dead last, and the lowest score that it got was one 7th place vote, and was also in first place 8 times, 22% of the time. And I'm on track here, since this was also my number 2. And you have to give props to the original. This is the film that establishes everything. Even if I'm not quite sure if there ever really is a formula to these flicks, but this one gives you the whole status quo of these guys. But here's what I find interesting about this one. I actually think that the whole basic plot is super cliche and stock horror movie. Like, you have a bunch of people in this big old spooky house, and they're being chased down and killed one by one. It's a standard framework that you can hang 100 different concepts on. And believe me, people have, and I've seen most of them. But then you layer in all these things that make this one unique and more interesting to watch. You have the Toulon lore and the flashback to the 30s or 40s or whatever time that they finally decided the intro was supposed to be. You have the puppets themselves, and they're probably the most noteworthy part of it all. It gives you this weird set of antagonists, with each one having their own situation going on, and they were drastically different than the other horror bad guys of the time. Unless you want to compare them to Chucky, since that had come out a year earlier. But to me, they feel a bit more of their own thing. But then there's the other strangeness going on here. There's the whole paranormal investigator and psychic stuff happening. So there's these surreal visions at times. And oh yeah, weird sex magic, of course. That being said, I will say that even though I do enjoy this one quite a bit, and clearly like it a lot here since I put it at number 2, but I've also never really loved it. And I think it's because that whole thing I was talking about with the basic nature of the storyline. But it's definitely loved, because even though it didn't have as many number 1 votes as the third film, it had generally high scores, which was enough to bring it close, but not quite there to number 1.
What the hell are you looking at?
Let's go to third place now, and this was a big jump since we go all the way down to 170 points, 62 more than our number 2 film, and we're looking at Puppet Master 2. This did get 3 dead last votes, 8% of the time, and it also got put into first place twice, 6% of them. And once again, my vote matches the consensus, since I had this also in third. And what's funny is that this is in some ways a bit of a retread of the original film. It's giving you the same setting, similar characters, and the same general setup for the plot. It's still at that old hotel, and a bunch of researchers go up there to see what's going on, and sure enough, there's someone controlling the puppets and trying to live forever, etc., etc. It's even the same ending, with the puppets realizing that they've been duped and turning on their master. But then, it's got this whole weird side to it that's different than the weird side that you had in the first one, and it was enough to boost it up for me. First off, you have the return of Toulon, and this was before they decided that he was going to sort of be like the default hero of this series, so he's a straight up villain here, something that they had to sort of contort continuity to fit in the later entries. But he's one of the more interesting parts here with that Invisible Man outfit. Plus, there's a couple of standout things here. One is the introduction of Torch, who is easily one of my favorite puppet designs in the entire series, and he's used to good effect. And for some reason, he gets to roast a little kid here. But not just any kid. A kid who whips his stripped down G.I. Joe dolls for some reason. Kid has anger issues. But the movie also has one of the weirdest things with the finale, where Toulon puts himself into a life-size puppet, and oh man, is this thing creepy looking. I don't normally look at the Puppet Master movies as scary or whatever, because let's face it, in terms of overall horror, there's very little of that in any of them. But then this thing shows up, and it's just so off-putting. I'm not sure that I would call it scary, but it's definitely not pleasant to look at. Oh, and one other reason that I gave this one a little extra points, and that's the inclusion of the great Buck Flower, even if he's a bit underused. We're out of the top 3 now, and go figure that the top 3 were the first re-released. So I guess we'll see if we stay on that track with our number 4 movie, and it wasn't a huge increase since we're only going up to 181 points. And look at that, it's not one of the OGs, and it's Puppet Master, The Littlest Reich. People were very split on this one since it was in dead last twice, 6% of them, and also put in first place 6 times, 17% of the time. 4 more than Puppet Master 2. And my streak continues since once again I had this right where it landed, and this was my number 4 movie as well. And there's a lot that I like about this one, and a few things that hold it back. First up, this is billed as a remake, and I think on that front it succeeds. It's taking the core essence of what the original was, and then expands on it and moves it someplace new without just replicating the original. You still have an assortment of Toulon's puppets attacking a group of people in an old spooky manner, but almost everything else has been switched up. But again, not to the point that it's unrecognizable. I know that some people took offense to Andre being shifted into the bad guy turf here, and in a big way since they went and made him an actual Nazi, but it works for the story, and since this is a different universe than the others, it makes sense. But here's what I really like in this one. The characters. I feel like Thomas Lennon is unsung in terms of having a strong character actor, and this one shows that he does more than just being goofy in short shorts. His interactions with Jennifer Pellicer are great and really make them likable and interesting leads. But then you have an assortment of fun side characters with Nelson Franklin, and then you have Barbara Crampton in there being awesome, and of course, you can't forget Cuddly Bear. So, having actual characters in these situations really ups the ante here and makes for a more compelling storyline overall. But then, there's the bad. The puppets just don't stand out nearly as much as the originals. Like, sure, there's more of them, but that's a point against for the movie since it doesn't really flesh any of them out, and they end up coming off as generic. Even Blade, who should be the, I guess, star of the show with the villains, is just another puppet here. And then, that ending. Man, does that let the air out a bit. Like, first up, I'm not crazy that they went with the downer ending, considering that they did a good job of building up these characters. There was one that I really felt horrible about seeing go, but that's not points against it that much, since I think that horror should kill characters that you like. But then they just go and end it on a to be continued. And I know that they intended to do more and then had issues with funding because the producer ended up being a complete tool bag. And then they couldn't find other finances until after their rights expired. I know that. But it still means we have this permanently, forgive the pun, dangling ending.
Don't ask. Don't ask.
Getting further down now in our number 5 movie was pretty close with Littlest Reich since it only went up 6 points, and sitting with 187 points, we're back to the originals with Puppet Master 4. This didn't get any dead last votes, but it did get one 13th place spot, a second to dead last, and was put into first place 3 times, 8% of them. And I have this one down a little lower than the consensus, since this is number 7 for me. And I like this one, but I also think this is where it starts to show its seams. Like, very clearly, they intended to switch the focus of the series from the puppets being these killers that are stalking people at the behest of a warped master, to them being the heroes of the film and having to face off against a common enemy. Introducing Sutekh is possibly one of the best moves that they made in the entire franchise, although I wish that they had kept that concept going for a while instead of basically just forgetting it not long after, but we'll talk about that. So this one gives us a new Puppet Master with Rick, and a new setup with him being the dolls' buddy and all that, but then gets a bit derailed by having them play laser tag for a while. And if you think that this is some sort of setup or a thing that pays off later in the film, well, guess again, because it does not. And this is just here for no reason, and it's a bit silly. And I think that my overall issue with this one is the villains. I like the look of the totems, and having them be Sutekh's pawns on Earth to reclaim Toulon's secrets is a good plot device. But then there's only 3 of the totems, and they're just little dolls with sharp claws. That's it. And they're up against like 5 of Toulon's puppets and a bunch of humans. And like one of the puppets has knives for hands. One has multiple guns. One has a goddamn drill on his head. Like how on earth am I supposed to see 3 of these totem things as a threat? And then they even bring in Decapitron, a new puppet, and definitely not one of my favorites. And he can electricity blast from his head. Like, come on, movie. Tell me that there's like 20 of these totems. So I feel like this is actually some sort of contest here. And then there's this bit at the end where the last remaining totem bursts through a door, and on the other side of that door is all of the good guy puppets. And am I supposed to think that anyone is in danger here? But all that being said, this is still on the fun end of things, and I like what they're doing here, but I just don't think that it's quite on the level of the ones that came before it.
I am with you, Puppet Master.
This is going to start to seem like a theme here, because as we go on to our number 6 movie, well, it did jump up a lot in points, almost a full 100 to 282 points total, and we have, not surprisingly, Puppet Master 5. Like Part 4, it also never got a dead last, but it did get 13th place, and it was put there 4 times. And this one never got any number 1s, and the highest score it got was 2nd place, which it did get twice. And I had this one much lower than most, since I put this one down in 10th place. And this is one of them that I just don't care that much about. And I should clarify that the subtitle for this one is The Final Chapter. And it said that there was the plan for it to be the last one, but we all know that that didn't stick. And come on, does it ever? But originally, the plots for Part 4 and 5 were meant to be one movie, and they wanted to release it theatrically, and it was just going to be called Puppet Master the Movie. But then plans for that fell through, and they decided to pad it out and extend parts of the script and make it 2 movies for the direct-to-video market. And wow, is that apparent. Like, so much of this film just feels like filler and a general repeat of what we had just seen in the last film, just with more wandering down hallways. And again, we're looking at the same failure as the last one. You're giving me a single totem figure as the villain. Like, sure, it's meant to be Sutekh himself in there, but it doesn't seem all that powerful, and it's still facing down all of the others, and even torches with them this time, so the odds are stacked even greater. They had to throw in a bunch of corporate raider stooges into the mix just to add more things to gum up the works, mainly just because the villain isn't really enough of a threat. Like, they even had to sideline Decapitron for the entire movie because they knew that if it was active, then this entire film would only last for 4 minutes. So I had this one lower because I feel like it's just giving you Part 4 again, but it's giving you a duller version of it. Like, sure, Part 2 is just a sort of retread of the first one, but it's also tossing some additional goofiness to it, whereas this one seems to actually pull back on all that. And can we talk about Sutekh's nipples? Like, I don't want to body shame the guy, but he might want to look into covering those things up every once in a while.
Hours here are spent, but for one, behold!
Let's look at our number 7 movie now, and we didn't jump up as many points, but it was still a nice increase to 301 points. And this is really tossing out our pattern here, since it's the most recent entry, Dr. Death. This was put in dead last twice, 6% of the times, and never got first, but it did get 1 second place vote. And I had this one quite a bit higher, since I put this one all the way up in 5th place. And I may have some personal preference here because the guy who wrote it is on my horror trivia team, but I dig this one. I feel like they had sort of dug themselves into a hole with the series at this point, and were just stuck doing World War II era stories because they thought that's what the audience wanted. So it's nice to see them do something that's a bit different. It feels like more of a throwback to the older films. I think that the biggest thing that this one has going for it is the production value, because even though this one was done on the cheap, it makes a little bit better use of the limited budget than you'd expect. It takes advantage of having a nice setting with the old folks' home, although I will never, ever forgive them for casting Melissa Moore as someone that should be in a care facility for the elderly. And I think that this also benefits from focusing on one of the lesser known puppets. Dr. Death appeared in Retro Puppet Master. And let's face it, that movie didn't really give the puppets a lot of time to be fleshed out or anything. So this is the most that we're seeing him. And I kind of wish that they took that tactic with more spin-off movies to give them more of a focus. That being said, one of the things that work against this movie is the fact that the Good Doctor still doesn't get a lot of screen time. I know that's mostly cost prohibitive, but there's a good deal of sort of basic ghost/zombie stuff going on here that I guess that Doc is responsible for, but it just means that we see less of him at work. And the lore stuff with his character is maybe too packed into the finale of the film without seeing enough of it throughout, as it's mostly about the goings-ons at the home, which is fine and all because it's well done enough, but I would have liked to have seen more of the Doc. I assume they chose him for a movie because he had the coolest look of all the retro bunch, but then they just don't show him enough.
I want to help you. I want to help you find your friends.
Coming in at number 8, dropping down even further as we're now in the back half of the movies here, but this was not too far away with 323 points, 22 points more, and pretty appropriately, it's the other spin-off film, Blade: The Iron Cross. This also got put into dead last twice, 6% again, and did also get one first place vote as well. And I have this one a lot lower since this one fell into 12th place for me, close to the bottom of my list. And maybe it's because I watched all of this in a row, but by this point, I was completely burnt out on the whole Axis stuff, and this is basically Axis Part 4, continuing with the characters and storylines from there. However, it doesn't really do anything different than those ones did, and isn't really giving me enough of a hook for a whole new storyline. It's kind of wild that Blade is clearly the most popular of the puppets. He's essentially the face of the franchise, and he is pretty damn cool looking, but it's interesting that he doesn't really have much in the way of a defined personality. Hell, outside of the third movie, he's never even really got that much of a fleshed out backstory. So I was kind of hoping that this movie would give him more of a focus and develop Blade as more of a character than just one of the puppets. But yeah, he's just one of the puppets here. Just a plot device that the movie has sort of hung around. And in the end, he doesn't even really matter all that much to it. And then, for some unexplained reason, he's 3 times the size that he was before. There's a point where he's meant to be like supercharged or something from his psychic link with the girl, but this isn't even connected to that. He's just bigger from the get-go. And I think that we're just meant to accept it. And like, fine, whatever, no big deal really, but then it's just a dull story that's not giving me anything new. I do think it's interesting that he's clearly the most known puppet and the most popular one, but when it came down to the 2 spin-off films, his is the lower ranked of the 2.
You
Let's head now to our number 9 film as we're headed to the bottom of that old barrel. And this was a fairly close race since this one had 329 points, only 6 more than Blade. And it's one that I actually thought might be lower since it's Curse of the Puppet Master, or I guess Puppet Master 6. This was put into dead last 3 times, 8% of the time, and the same amount as Puppet Master 2. But this was also put into first place twice, 6% of the time. And I also had this one pretty low, and in fact, had it right where it landed, because this was my 9th place pick. And I just don't get what they were going for here. Like, this is just a couple of years after they said, this is the final chapter. But then they just come back with this. And you go from this lore-heavy movie that sets up a new puppet master, a new status quo, a new villain, the return of Toulon as an active force helping them, the crew now as agents of good, and then you come back with this? Not only is all of that basically tossed to the side, it's not even mentioned. The name Andre Toulon isn't even said once in the film. It's so wonky that there's become fan theories about when this one takes place, putting it after the second film in order to try to explain why so much is out of whack. And I guess that the script is just a remake of a kind of the Snake movie from the 70s. And yeah, I don't know why they went this route, but they did, and it was the first big dropping of the ball of the franchise. I suppose because it feels like they were figuring out what to do with these guys, but then just didn't do it. Instead, we get this narrative, which barely even features the puppets. That there's such an afterthought in this movie. And yeah, it feels like they were shoved into a pre-existing script. And the story that we get instead just isn't that good. It's dry and dull, and the characters all fall flat, with the only bright spots of the film being when the little guys actually do anything. But unfortunately, there's hardly any of that here. You get this one crazed moment of WTF when Tunneler decides to do his thing right up into a guy's bathing suit area, and this movie needed more of that. More of that weirdness that you had in the first couple. But the limited characters and backwoods setting don't really allow for all that, so you end up with a stale entry. I do give it a touch more credit, though, for at least doing something different and telling a different kind of story. Granted, I don't care for what that story is, and I think I may have preferred they stick to the formula in this case, but I will always respect something that takes a chance. Going into the double-digit entries now, and the competition is pretty tight now. And speaking of tight, this next one is in 10th place by only 1 point. Curse had 329 points, and with 330 points, we're looking at Retro Puppet Master, or I guess Puppet Master 7. This was put at the dead last 4 times, the most of any film so far, for 11% of the entries, and the best score that it received was 3rd place, which it got 1 time. And I guess I like this one slightly more than the majority, although not by much, since I have this one in 8th place. And for me, this is the film that draws the line in the sand for the franchise. Every film that I have ranked before this one, my 1 through 7, I enjoy watching. Every one that I ranked after this one, my 9 through 14, I do not. And this one is one that I don't mind. It's right on that fence. There's things that I enjoy about it, and things that I don't. First up, I like that it tries to get things back on track. After Curse, they were like, oh yeah, this is called Puppet Master. I guess we should feature that guy and that concept. Considering Part 6 didn't even have a Puppet Master, just a guy who kept them in cages. And remember what I said about liking chances being taken? This sticks with what the series had given us so far. That lore of Toulon and finding the secrets of the puppets and his whole backstory, and it gives us more of that. So we're going with stuff that we're familiar with. But then it's taking that shot of giving you completely different puppets. So there's a whole new cast. And essentially, any of your favorites that you might watch to see are absent. And because of that, you hope that the retro guys are cool themselves. And yeah, they look cool. But then there's where the stuff that I don't like comes in. The puppets matter so little to this overall story. They're sidelined for so much of the action and aren't fleshed out whatsoever. And so much of the plot is devoted to Toulon the man, and that could be interesting, but they just don't do much with all that either, so it feels a lot like filler. And of course, I have to mention Greg Sestero in this as Toulon, because this was well before he became an icon for being in the room. And with this film, I think you can see why he wasn't really booking a bunch of stuff. He's pretty empty here. And he just doesn't have that charm that Guy Rolfe infuses the older Anton with.
You're a 3,000-year sorcerer from Egypt, and you want to teach me the secret of life?
As we get closer to the bottom, you'll notice that we haven't covered any of the Axis trilogy yet, and there's only 4 movies to go. So as we touch on number 11 here, I suppose we'll find out if they dominate the bottom 3. And at number 11, with 348 points, 18 points more than Retro, we have Axis of Evil, Puppet Master 9, technically. This was only given one dead last vote, and the highest score that it got was pretty low at 6th place, which it only got one time. And this is another that I have right where it landed, since I have this as number 11 also. And I really want to like this more because it has all the ingredients that I'm looking for from one of these. It has puppets working on the side of good, led by a new sort of puppet master, I guess. It has the World War II setting, which works well for the whole vibe of it. It's got the lore down by setting this immediately after Chulon kills himself and tries to fill in the gap between that event and the first movie. And all of that should add up to something really good, but holy cow, does it not accomplish any of those things. And I'm going to blame most of this on the budget, since there was a massive money decrease between this and pretty much any of the earlier entries. So they just didn't have the means to do some of the things that are essential. Dave Allen, who did the stop motion for the earlier films, hadn't been a part of the series since like number 5, and the lack of those bits hurt in general. So we're stuck with them just using the guys as dolls or marionettes or whatever else they would use to make them move, but only ever so slightly, since anything else would cost money. But in terms of giving us World War II action, everything just feels so low rent. It's about Nazis at work on American soil and sabotage and the like. And remember what I said about that production value in part 3 and how it did a good job of selling the setting? Well, none of that is on display here, and it's just not convincing in terms of the time frame of it all. And then you have the villain of it, and he's just the most generic, I'm a Nazi bad guy possible. Like part of that is the performance, which is lackluster, but it's also the script that just has him reading off standard diabolical lines with no flair or dynamism. I mean, the last Nazi bad guy we had was Richard Lynch, and those are pretty big shoes to fill, but man, this ain't even close.
If these two are an example of Japan's finest, your country has no hope for winning this war.
Okay, now it's time for number 12, and this next film is a film that I was really curious about what people thought about, and it turns out that the opinion was pretty split, since with 352 points, only 4 more than Axis of Evil, it's Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys. It did get put into dead last 6 times, 17% of the time, and the biggest percentage so far, but it was actually also put into first 1 time. And that wasn't me, but I definitely had this higher up than most, since I put it in 6th. And look, I get it. I totally understand. If this is your dead last, I understand. This is not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's quite bad. But somehow, I still dig it. And for starters, this isn't considered an actual part of the franchise. It's not by Full Moon, much like The Littlest Reich. Another company made this one outside of Charles Band's care, and it was produced as a sci-fi original movie, and they had to produce all their own stuff for it, which is why the puppets have a different look. And when I say different, what I mean is crappier. If the whole ordered from Wish joke hadn't been played out, I'd probably use that here, but I guess these are like Temu puppets. But I think that the thing that wins me over here is that it just does not take itself seriously at all. It clearly knows what it is, and it isn't pretending to be anything else. And all of the actors do seem in on it. I mean, the ending has a showdown with a demon wearing a Santa Claus suit, so it's clearly not meant to be regarded as actual cinema. But when I say that the actors seem in on it, the one leading the way there is none other than Corey Feldman. Now, Corey has had a rough time of late, and judging from some of the interviews and such that I've seen with him, I'm not sure that self-awareness is one of his strong suits, and the guy looks to take himself a little too seriously, but not here. Here, he seems like he's having a blast and hamming it up, and they have him playing an older man with a teenage daughter, and he was like around 32 or 3 at the time, and it's certainly possible that he could have a girl that age. But I guess that they wanted to go a different direction with it and make his character older, and how they achieved that was simply putting some gray tint to his hair and then having him talk with this gruff voice.
Dork, What do you mean, dork? She thought I was sexy.
And what's funny is that I think he enjoyed that voice, since he basically used it again when they did the Lost Boys sequel, although there he was meant to be a tough guy, not an old one. And I would possibly have ranked this a little lower, but I notched it up a point or two just for the scene where Corey runs. Because what is he even doing here?
Hey, come here, you! You're scared, you should be scared. Get away from me! Get away from me!
Alright, only 2 movies left, and they're both Axis films, but which is the bottom? Which one is dead last? Well, let's see our runner-up, since our number 13 movie with 375 points is Puppet Master Axis Termination, Puppet Master 11. This was ranked in dead last 6 times, the same amount as PM versus DT, 17% of the time, but this only managed to get up to 4th place, and it only got that once. And go figure, I had this one right there, since this was in 13th place for me as well. And I've kind of said it before, but I really think they botched this whole era, because I think that this was on the right path, but it was just held back by the money aspect of things. They start to kind of move things in the right direction here, because they bring back some of the weirdness that made the earlier ones work, and they have some psychics and a girl with hypodermic needles on her fingers, and all of that could be good, but it's just surrounded by a bunch of not interesting things. And I know that I've said this for a few entries, but I'm gonna say it again. There's just not nearly enough puppets here. And this one not only doesn't feature them that much, but the plot structure doesn't even focus all that much on the lore. What's funny is that they seemingly didn't really know what to do with Danny and Beth, the 2 characters who were the leads of the first 2 chapters of the trilogy, and literally just killed them off really quickly. And that basically just takes that whole ongoing aspect of Danny being the guy who discovered the box and tosses it away. We're then left with a big old beefcake guy and an assortment of psychics to take down the Nazis, but no one is really connected to that earlier storyline, which feels really weird considering that this was billed as the Axis trilogy, and instead it's 2 movies that are connected, and then this one. One thing that they do with this one that's kind of funny is that they actually shoot some of the puppet footage with live action actors against a green screen, and it's pretty damn noticeable. But you know what? I'm not mad at it, but I kind of am, because it was a method that they could have used in lieu of the stop motion to feature the dolls more. But then they don't. They had a new way to factor them in more that wouldn't have cost an arm and a leg, and they didn't even bother to utilize it. And that brings us to our big winner today, the last on our list, and our dead last. The worst of the Puppet Master series, and with a whopping 398 points out of that possible 504, it's Puppet Master Axis Rising, or Puppet Master 10. This one was actually put into dead last spot 5 times, 1 time less than either Termination or the Versus film, so 14% of the times, and the best score that it got was only 6th place, which it only got 1 time, so the scores were overall pretty damn low. And I had it pretty damn low myself, since this one was my dead last as well. And yeah, it's fairly satisfying to see this one here, because holy cow, what a pointless, silent fart of a film that this is. First up, I guess they couldn't get any of the same actors from the last one, because I suppose that they wanted $51 instead of $50, and Charles Band said no. So pretty much everyone is recast, and they just brought in people that don't look or sound or act anything like the other ones. So you have this weird disconnect there. And what's funny is they brought the same 2 actors back for the 3rd one, and that's when they just off them. Like, maybe you could have done that here instead. Oh, well, we can't get our leads back, so let's move away from these characters. But no, they just stick with them, with these new actors. But then in the next one, when they do get them back, that's when they're like, oops, they're dead. But one thing that really brings this one down for me is that it's basically just the last movie again. A bunch of standing around in rooms and warehouses and worrying about the Nazis infiltrating, but nothing really happening because that would cost money to show. And keep in mind, Band directed this one himself. He's overseen the entire franchise, and this was the first time that he sat in the director's chair. And this is what he came up with. And then there's the two things that should have saved this from dead last for me, but sadly didn't. First up, it has Brad Potts as the Sarge, and he's pretty fun here and hams it up. And I've worked with this guy in a couple of industrial films, and he was a solid guy who sadly passed away last year. But he's just not in this enough, and his character doesn't really do much. But then it introduces a set of evil puppets for our good guys to go up against you, and let me tell you, they suck. The tank one is halfway decent, but the rest are pointless. Like, one's just a werewolf, which is dumb because it's a doll. Like it's not a werewolf if it's always a wolf and doesn't change because it was made in wolf form. It's a wolf doll, not a werewolf. But then there's Bombshell, and her face is one of the worst sculpted things. Like, this is like you went on vacation and wound up in some bootleg shop and they had a bunch of clearly knockoff toys like Robert Cop and Nightmare Fetty, and this was just their version of Barbie, like just the Nazi version. And her main feature is just a ripoff of a fembot with bullet boobs, and just isn't that interesting. But then there's Kamikaze, and this was in 2012, and Charles Band was like, hey guys, can I come up with the most racist puppet I could think of? And other people around him were like, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't. And he was like, too late, Kamikaze. And all those people were like, well, at least we're glad you got that out of your system and won't try to outdo yourself next year. And Band was like, hold my beer. So there you have it, 14 Puppet Master movies. And let's check out our final roster. And, you know, I'm not mad at this. I was kind of hoping that the Versus movie would have been higher, but I fully understand why it's not. But this is a pretty accurate representation of the quality level on display here. But as always, let me know down below in the comments how you would have voted and what would have been your number one or your dead last. And you know, you too can vote by going to patreon.com/movietimelines. I post a new list every single month for all of our patrons to rank up, and you can do one, every other one, whatever you like. You can participate in as many as you wish. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button. If you enjoy the channel overall, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell to get notified when new videos are released. And yes, go to patreon.com/movietimelines to help support like my patrons do, and they are awesome. But then, thank you for coming back and watching these videos. I always appreciate that, and we'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.